Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York Jewish Film Festival. This festival and this special panel discussion is a presentation of the Jewish Museum and the Film Society of Lincoln Center. I'm Aviva Weintraub from the Jewish Museum, and it's a thrill and an honor to welcome our panelists this afternoon. We're delighted that Richard Pena will moderate the panel. Richard is an old and very good friend of the Film Festival since its beginning. Richard is the former program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the New York Film Festival. He's a professor of film at Columbia University. Thank you for your help this afternoon, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Aviva. It's really a pleasure to be back. First of all, just want to congratulate our two filmmakers who are here on the panel, Ori Rudofsky and Joseph Dorman, for their really extraordinary film. It's a really rich and provocative film, and I know we'll all have a lot to say about it. But to begin, I want to ask our three panelists each to give a short summary of their feelings, ideas, questions, comments about the film. And to begin, I'd like to ask Yael Zurabowski to begin with her comments about the film.
Thank you. First, I have to say it really was a privilege to screen the film in its premiere. It's a very engaging film. I hope that all of you have seen it, or if not, are going to see it. It's not a short film, but it really has kept my interest even in the second viewing, and I take it as a major test. The focus of the film is clearly on Zionism and its meaning in Israel. And I stress it because, there are possibilities also to explore the meaning of Zionism outside of Israel, and you might have different perspectives by Jews outside of Israel. The film is constructed historically, so there is definitely a historical perspective, but it offers juxtapositions between past and present that actually break the chronological order and add tremendous amount to the interest in the film. So we see photos of Zichron Yaakov, the old Jewish Moshava, and then, abruptly switching to Tel Aviv with dance music and the beach scenes, and that really makes it very alive. Throughout the film, we get a sense of the key historical points in the development of Israeli society and the development of Israel. But what's more interesting is that we get different points of view. And one of the things that is really the most important thing to the credit of the film is the fact that the directors brought in so many people with so many different points of view. Now, of course, there is a possibility to bring even more. It's not like one can exhaust it, but they have really done a very good job to show some diversity with, some limits. And I will talk about it briefly afterwards. What was interesting for me is to see to watch and to hear people respond to the key historical points. That, of course, I know the historical background. I, study this, and I'm reading the paper, and still I have to say there were different things. It was interesting and important to hear it from the mouth of people who have lived it, their families lived it, and to get the personal angle. And I think the film does a very good job in providing this perspective. Now, I want to say just very few points about some questions and comments in terms of the narrative in the film. So the broadest thing that I can say that ultimately this is a Zionist narrative in the broader historical sense, The focus, I think it's most obvious in the introduction to the film, that the focus is on Jewish exile, and the way that it's presented it is with an emphasis on pogroms, photos of dead bodies, a grim view of Jewish exile. even the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, is presented as a negative force. And so we are a bit left with questions about it. What about the Jewish achievements in exile? What about Jewish, communities flourishing in exile? What about figures like Einstein, Buber? Where did they grow up? That is a bit of a ideological bent that a priori presents, it from the Zionist perspective. The other thing that I want to point out, and it's not in a way of criticism, but in a way of just showing what are other questions that can be explored, because, there is a limit to what one can do in a film, and the film really has done a tremendous amount. But let me just throw out the issues. The problems, the discussion really focuses on the development of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it is a major topic. Some other problems were alluded. I can't even say that they were ignored. They were alluded, but there are major points that, in terms of discussion, one could point out to. The impact of the occupation on Israeli society, the rise of radicalism, violence, the lack of tolerance. There are allusions to that, but I think that I would even more focus about the weakening of democratic values, which is something that the Israeli society is very intensely debating now, and it's a point that is really of major concern, at least to a section or a segment of Israeli society. The attitude to Palestinian citizens of Israel, whether, what was used to be called Israeli Arabs, some people still refer Israeli Arabs, the Negev Bedouins, the attitude towards Ethiopians, non-Jews. And I would say now, in the last year or so, we can really say that a major focus of concerns is even the lack of tolerance to the so-called leftists, Smolanim, activists, writers. If you just look at the news from the last day, or you saw the news in the summer. The other point that one should add is the emigration from Israel. The film focuses on the Aliyah, and of course this is the driving force in terms of the Zionist history or historiography. But there is also huge emigration from Israel, and it's really nice. You do allude to it with Orly, the activist who talks about it. But Orly is one of many. There are many Israeli youth, there are many families where children are here, but even older people who leave Israel at this point. So there is a sense of disillusionment with a continuing conflict, with a changing face of Israeli society. And of course, I would end with a move from talking about the past to talking about the future. And this is probably where the most intense debate would take place.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to move on to Saeed Zidani for his comments and thoughts on the film.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay. Let me begin by congratulating the filmmakers on their tremendous efforts as well on their impressive achievement. Let me also express my deep thanks for the kind invitation extended to me to participate in this important panel discussion. You notice that something is wrong with my voice. It's not only because I'm excited, but it's also because I have problem with my vocal cords, so you have to excuse me if I do not speak as fluently as should be. So in what follows, I'll make very brief remarks about the film and the reality it attempts to portray or represents. But I will not be engaged in film aesthetics or in film criticism. The first point, it is a film about Zionism, not only the idea, but also the project. It's not a film about the Israel-Palestine conflict, though the two issues are not easy to separate in practice. A film about the Palestine-Israel conflict requires a different kind of balance between interviewees, The Palestinian interlocutors, Palestinians interviewed in the film, me included, focus on the price Palestinians have had to pay for the realization of the Zionist idea or project at the different stages: displacement and disposition, 48, occupation, 67, and perennial discrimination against Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. Palestinians are in no doubt the victims of the Zionist project. This victimhood accounts for their resistance against the Zionists from the very beginning, since the Balfour Declaration, more specifically since the Balfour Declaration in 1917. 1948 is the most defining moment in Palestinian history, or in the Israel-Palestine conflict. 1948, we call it the year of the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinians. 2/3 of the Palestinians became refugees after, when Israel was, few months after Israel was declared as an independent state. And the whole country, it changed owners. Regrettably, the film does not give these events of 48 the importance that they should be given. The second point, remark, what is clear to me and what the film makes it crystal clear is that the political decision or the processes that lead to such a political decision to create a Jewish state in Palestine was taken against the background of anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe, associated with the rise of what I call ethnic nationalism. It is this version of nationalism, as opposed to citizen nationalism, that is responsible for the rise of Zionism, as well as for its orientation to create a similar state for the Jews in Palestine, the Jews newly defined as a national group. The decision to create such a state preceded the horrors of the Holocaust. The Holocaust accounts primarily for the urgency as well as for the international support for the Zionist project. In short, the context for the rise of Zionism is the 19th century ethnic nationalism in Europe. I think that was made clear in the film, but it should be emphasized all the time. Third, this ethnic nationalism also accounts for the tension or conflict in Israel between the democratic component and the Jewish component in the normative definition of Israel as a democratic and Jewish state. As a democracy, Israel is committed to treating all its citizens with equal consideration and respect. But as a Jewish state, it's committed to Jews and to Jewish concerns first and foremost. As long as Israel continues to be defined as a Jewish state, pervasive discrimination against the Palestinian citizens in Israel, or what I call them semi-citizens, is simply unavoidable. The state tells me, because I am a citizen of the state, but the state tells me on every relevant occasion, you do not belong. The state is not yours. You are the undesirable other. So the big question is it really possible to sustain such an ethnic democracy for the long run? I personally doubt it. Some of the speakers in the film cast doubts about it too. My last remark has to do with a question that the film almost avoided. it has to do with the morality of the whole issue. What I say is Zionism cannot be just as long as discrimination against non-Jews who are citizens of Israel, or the state of Israel, persists. Zionism cannot be just as long the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank continues. Zionism cannot be just as long as Palestinian refugees and their plights are not adequately addressed. In short, Zionism cannot be just unless the Palestinian issue in all its aspects is fairly treated or addressed. Shall I continue, or I think we should give the other speaker? I'll come to these points later.
Thank you, Said. And on to Jeremy Kalmanowski.
Hi, everybody. I come to this conversation as neither an academic student of Jewish culture or an expert on the Palestinian political scientist and a philosopher and an expert on Palestinian people and not an Israeli citizen either, but as a community rabbi here in New York. So happens that Oren and Aviva are both in my congregation, which is how I find myself here today. Some of you are also in my congregation. So I came to this and observed the film, and I want to comment on what it said about Jewish history and the momentousness of what Zionism does for Jewish history. And the film brought great expression to this in powerful ways. I often say in the synagogue, and people accuse me of being hyperbolic, and I'm probably a little hyperbolic when I say that the creation of Jewish society in its ancestral homeland is the most important thing that's ever happened to the Jewish people. Certainly the most important thing that's ever happened to the Jewish people since the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago. When I use that hyperbolic phrase, people say, okay, you can't identify Jewish history with the state of Israel, and I try to make a fine distinction between Jewish society in the ancestral homeland and the state of Israel, which is a political state like everybody else, which has, corruption and venality, and the president is a rapist, and the other prime minister is going to jail too, and all of those things which are horrifying in any political entity, they're true in Israel too. It doesn't make Israel a model society, because governments are governments, but Jewish society, the ingathering of the exiles, the crawling out of the concentration camps to build a new society, to respond to the most unbelievable act of devastation and destruction which the Jewish people experienced in the middle of the 20th century, and to respond to that with the greatest act of rebuilding and renewal that the Jewish people have ever experienced. That, to me, is the most important thing that's ever happened in Jewish history. And the film, I thought, did a tremendous job of giving voice to that. Of course, as Said's comments said with great acuity, and as Orly Noyce said in the film, that's the story of somebody who jumps out of a burning building and lands on somebody else's head, right? So there is no way to tell that story without reckoning with, and the film does a fine job vividly and with I think a moral conscience as well as fine storytelling, to wrestle with the injustice and oppression that has been foisted on the Palestinians. And frankly, nobody with their eyes open and only a fool would deny, or a tendentious person would deny that the Palestinians are oppressed and suffering, and that must be reckoned with. But Zionism represents, for a student of Jewish history or somebody living in Jewish community, Zionism represents not only an exploitation, or one hears the word colonialism cited all the time, and I don't deny that there are oppressive elements in what has happened in the Zionist project since 1948, but it's fundamentally, for a Jew, a liberation. It's a liberation of Jewish history. Now, one thing I want to say about the film, again, not a criticism, because the truth is what I left the film saying is what I want is the full 12-hour Ken Burns treatment here. You know, there's so much in these rich 2.5 hours, and also so much that I missed. You know, I felt that there were momentous elements that you just couldn't address at all in 2.5 hours. So there were a whole host of things that I missed, but the one thing that I want to call most attention to, and it returns to the point that I made about the distinction between a political entity and a society. The film, as Yael said, Yael said, tells the story of Jews have to escape, you know, the Cossacks and the Nazis, and they have to escape the physical threats of Central and Eastern Europe, and that's why Zionism was incredibly important, and that's certainly obviously an important element in that story. But me, you know what I really want to be is an Achad Ha'am Zionist. If it weren't for the Shoah, I wouldn't have needed a state. Okay, Achad Ha'am, the cultural Zionist thinker from the early part of the 20th century, famously, or depending on your persuasion, infamously said, one university is more important than 100 farms. Okay? You guys are going to build your farms, that's great. I'm worried about culture. I'm worried about literature, I'm worried about those elements of Jewish life, and we don't need to bring every Jew from everywhere in the world to come live in our ancestral homeland. What we need is a cultural engine in our ancestral homeland, a renewed Hebrew. And I think if it weren't for the Shoah, that would have been great. But of course, there was the Shoah. And it changed what Jews needed to, the physical safety that Jews also needed from Zionism. To me, the Achad Ha'am project, and needless to say, the left-wing coexistence projects of the non-statist Judah Magnus, Martin Buber variety, the Brit Shalom variety of the 1920s and 30s, are roads not taken that in the whole sweep of Zionism, I would like us in the 21st century to engage with more, and I hope that in additional material that our discussions about Zionism include those things more. Finally, the other thing that I just thought was so fine about the film, and is really, again, for me as a Jewish person living in Jewish community who thinks that Zionism and our society in the state of Israel is so important, the film did a fabulous job of bringing to the fore that in the wake of 1967, between the right and the left, between the religious and the secular Zionism, there was really a pivot point over the soul and the mission of religious Zionism. I thought Gersh Gorenberg's comment that in the wake of 1967 and 1973, Gush Emunim took the state and turned it back to a movement. I thought that was a very sharp comment. If I were going to say anything critical about the film, the only thing that I would say, and I'm by no means a right-winger, I feel relatively little affinity with the Israeli right. If I was going to make any critical comment, I would think that the right was a little bit caricatured in the film in some ways, perhaps. I think that Aryeh Eldad, he's a tough guy, and I think that there may have been right-wing speakers who I would like to hear from who do not say, listen, either you believe that God gave us the land in the Torah, or it makes no sense, or it's just theft. I'm pretty sure those aren't the only two options.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to ask Ored and Joseph if they'll respond to the comments we've heard from our other panelists.
I'll let Joe respond to all those comments. He might do a better job at that than I will. But first of all, I just want to thank you, Richard, for moderating the panel, and you guys for showing up, and Yael and Saeed and Jeremy, but especially Saeed to come from Israel and come here and face a crowd of probably 99% Jews, and except for you, Richard. And no, I really, I'm not going to really address your points because they're, first of all, it's wonderful to hear your comments and your thoughtful comments, and part of the mission Joe and I were on was to find people as articulate as the three of you, but Israelis and Palestinians, and just Israelis and Palestinians. The film does not have any brilliant American speakers or brilliant Europeans or from wherever they are. We chose, one thing we chose to do was focus just on Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, etc. And I just want to give a shout out up there to Arthur Hertzberg, who's no longer with us, who way up there, yes. He wrote a book, edited a book called The Zionist Idea, which is where the present and perhaps not final title is from. And I remember he spoke at a panel back in the days when everybody was extremely hopeful. I think it was 1994 or 5. He spoke with Yossi Beilin about Oslo in the early years, and I remember also being at a panel at Columbia where Jews and Palestinians were dancing together to the Intifada song because they thought it was going to lead to peace. But one thing that Arthur Hertzberg said in his speech was the holiest place for him is not the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, which a lot of Jews think of as the place, but it's Ben Gurion Airport, and he said the most religious moment of his life was when the passport control guy would stamp the Israeli passport control guy would stamp his passport, and that to him was the most moving moment every time he went to Israel. And that's really at the crux of the film, in a way, is the two among the other things you have all spoken about, is the two Zionisms that are at war with each other right now. Whether they're both unjust in whatever way, there's a sense, as in the film is stated, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, when he had the choice of Yigal Allon said, we can take the whole thing in 48, he said, well, we could, but we want a democratic state, or attempt to have a democratic state. And the only way we can have that is by having a majority Jewish state, and whether that came at the price of Arab expulsion or not letting them return, that was and that's the same battle that is going on right now. It might appear right now as if the forces that believe not in a democratic state but in the whole land maybe are winning, but that has yet to be seen. Anyway, I will let Joe take it from there, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for letting me take it from there. Is this on? No. They're silencing me. I would love to be able to say I appreciate and agree with all the praise and disagree with the criticism, but in fact, I agree with all the criticism as well. I mean, I think everything all three of you said are very legitimate points. And kind of interesting and eye-opening when you set about to make a film like this, when we set out to make a film like this, you try to be as expansive and to have your eyes as wide open as possible, and of course it's impossible. It's impossible. You know, it's interesting when Yael says it's a Zionist perspective, it absolutely is a Zionist perspective. That's a blinker. That's a set of blinkers we had. And what, when Saeed talked about, and it was interesting, yesterday I had Saeed over and watched him watch the film for the first time. And He kept saying you looked younger in the film, but I think you still look quite young. No, it's interesting because you mentioned 48. And I watched, one of the really interesting things I watched, and I don't know if it's true because I was trying to read your mind, was as the first part, the way we, for those who haven't seen the film, the way we narrate the 48 war and almost every incident, if not, well, every incident in the film, first one sees it from the Jewish or / Zionist perspective, and then one hears Palestinian criticism or a counter-narrative. Which is never as large, obviously, as the Zionist narrative, because it is a film about Zionism. But I watched at one moment when we were telling the story primarily from a Jewish point of view, and I watched Saeed went like this. I saw him going up like this, a little uncomfortable, and then the Arab voices came in, a bit of a deep breath, and you lean back. Now, unfortunately, I thought you had leaned back metaphorically, maybe more than you did based on what you said. But I'll step back a little from the issues, the specifics of the questions about left and right in Israel and Palestinian and Jews in Israel. From the perspective of nationalism, I know Oren and I came at this film from slightly different perspectives. For me, it was fascinating just looking at from the largest perspective the idea of what nationalism is and what it means, and understanding nationalism and understanding it from a Jewish perspective was at the heart of what this was, I think, for me. And that means how it connects with Jewish identity, with Jewish culture, with what it means to be a Jew today, which are some of the things that I think I'm obsessed with and have been most of my life. I'm in and out of shul. I mean, it's interesting. I actually go to Anshe Chesed, but I only pay on high holy days. So this is my ambivalence towards my.
Get over it.
Anyway. And I've been doing that for 23 solid years, or 30 years, whatever. But in any case, one of the most profound statements in the film for me is from Yuli Tamir, the former Minister of Education, who actually studied in the field of nationalism and talked about the fact that nothing is true in the field of nationalism. And everything is kind of a myth, regardless of who the nationality is. And this goes to ethnic nationalism, what Saeed is saying. And as she points out, it's true that Jews lived there 2,000 years ago. There are archaeological and historical facts, as all nationalisms take into geographic and archaeological and historical facts, but they mold them, they mythify them. And there's something about that is fundamental to human need. I've had arguments, including with one of our editors, about the importance of nationalism. It's gotten a bad name. I happen to believe it's a fundamental human need, as Yuli said, like love, because that need for identity is very, very powerful. And I also happen to think, very briefly, that the Jews do need a state. I mean, my only contention with Ahad Ha'am and the notion of cultural nationalism versus political nationalism is I don't think there could be cultural nationalism without political nationalism, that the Jews simply, for very basic reasons, needed a state for questions of protection. But once you've said that, the problem here at its root is, and I think this is part of what our film is about, and I think it mimics a journey that I think Oren and I shared in our lives, is if you are a Jewish nationalist, how can you see, and can you see well enough the other side, the Palestinian side? And growing up, I think we both grew up with the classic narrative that did not see the Palestinian side. And this film, which we made at the ages of 57 and 56, is a product of this moment in time, at a moment when we were able, more than ever, and yet not enough, able to see the Zionist perspective, or allow ourselves to see it through Palestinian eyes within our limitations, and I accept those limitations because they're there. But and that goes to just one point when we were, from a very personal level, when we're sitting there and interviewing people, and Saeed I don't know, there are 7 or so Palestinians in the film. We came to Saeed.
There are more. There are the ones in the cafe.
Oh, okay, but major character, something like that. By the time I got to Saeed, I had been through a very interesting experience. I remember the first person I interviewed who's in the film is a man named Walid. What's Walid? Mullah. And Walid is a terrific guy, intellectual, smart, thoughtful, sensitive, all these things. And as I started to interview him, I heard him giving a very thoughtful, I won't say ferocious, but a very strong critique of Zionism. And which, of course, also I heard from Said a month or two later, whenever that was. But it was one of the most painful, difficult interviews I've ever done in my life, because the beauty of interviewing someone is you get to be neutral, right? You get to ask them a question, and you get to hear whatever they have to say, but you want them to say whatever. You want them to, you're looking for a film full of argument and contradiction. Never have I been so personally, emotionally challenged by something that I held so deeply dear, the feeling that I wanted Zionism to be absolutely just, is when I heard what critiques that I couldn't deny, and I couldn't fight back. And it was so powerful, and it was such a great experience. And I think, just to close here, that I think, and I think this may be true for Oren, although I'll let him speak for himself, that the trajectory of this film, of these two people's attempt to both have their own national identities, powerful national identities, which speaks so much to who you are in the world, and somehow hold on to those, at the same time being able to recognize the other. I guess this is Martin Buber in a nutshell, though I haven't really read him, to be able to do that. But I can quote him anyway, because that's what we do in New York. Anyway, but to be able to do both, passionately hold those two, to see the other and passionately hold to what you feel is strong, is the hardest thing. And the fact is, the Palestinian narrative and the Jewish narrative, no matter how much I like Said, no matter how much he may like me, our narratives are never going to match up. They cannot. And what we have to do, and a much more powerful, profound level, Israelis and Israeli Jews and Palestinians have to do, is find some modus vivendi together while holding those two positions. So that I think was one of the great lessons I think we learned from the film, and I'll leave it there.
Can I add something? Now that I've been outed as a non-Jew, I actually grew up in New York, and I didn't know a Protestant well till I got to college. My entire world was Catholics and Jews. So as I said, I was married to a Jewish woman. In fact, Oren's father almost married us. But that's true. That's true. Anyway, we were when we decided, we raised our children as Jews, and we sent them to Hebrew school. And one day I went to pick up my daughter at Hebrew school, and I was shocked to find that in Hebrew school that day, they were drawing Israeli flags. I thought, what in God's name does this have to do with Hebrew school? I mean, I thought they were learning about the prophets or the Ten Commandments or Bible stories, but why would you be in Hebrew school drawing Israeli flags? I mean, I didn't send my child to Israeli school. I sent her to Hebrew school. I thought it was religious training. She was preparing for a bat mitzvah. It really bothered me, and I discussed it with my wife, and she kind of was sympathetic. She said, well, they do these things, but I was really kind of angered at this. I mean, so I guess my question is, at this point, is Jewish identity so intrinsically wound up with Israel that there's no separation?
So, that's something that if I can say a word about my own congregation, that's something that is an extremely live topic, because there is in my 10025 synagogue, and I imagine that this is becoming more and more throughout the country, and probably not evident in all parts of the country, but outside of Orthodoxy, I think one finds an increasing sense that there's too much overlap between those two things. There's not, I wouldn't call it a large critical mass of people in Anshe Chesed who consider themselves non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist, but there are some, and there are some people who feel that the over-identification with the political entity of Medinat Yisrael is an improper mingling of a religious culture with a given political entity. And they certainly have a point to be made, especially when, as we all know, the state of Israel is under terrific security pressures and often does all kinds of things that would make any morally attuned person very uncomfortable, with respect to the occupation in particular. So there's certainly in my synagogue people who say you have to disentangle these two things. And my own position is, as I alluded to before, which I'll just repeat right now, I think it's a huge mistake to over-identify one's Jewish, i.e. cultural and religious and spiritual identity, with the political entity of the state. But this is one of the things that makes Judaism unique as a religion, is that it is inextricably tied with Jewish peoplehood. And though I think you are correct that the specific articulations of early Zionism are a product of 19th century European ethnic nationalism, I think that is correct. But I think they built upon deep, deep reserves of Jewish peoplehood as a religious value. And so if 21st century people want to say, listen, Bibi Netanyahu and my religious life should not be intertwined, I'm with you. But if people want to say, my religious life is my synagogue, it's Shabbat, it's my eating practice, it's studying the Torah, but it's not tied with the fate of the Jewish people, then I consider that an inadequate engagement with Jewish peoplehood as a religious concept. So at this point, approximately 50% of the world's Jews live in Israel. Okay? And for me, as a religious person, as a religious leader, I want to affirm that Jews ought to be concerned with the fate and well-being of the settlement, the project of Jewish settlement in its ancestral homeland. By settlement, I don't mean the post-67 territories. I mean Jewish society in the land of Israel.
If I can add to it, I think that is probably going to rise as a major concern. I think that what we see now is really a beginning of a process that would intensify, and something like the writing of Peter Beinart on this issue, the need to approach people outside of the established Jewish community. So I think that what we see is a diversity with American Judaism and a growing gap between the established, the affiliated Jewish community and Jews by and large. And so what you have seen and what you describe is really from the angle of an establishment, educational establishment, but it's there. And I think that it's, what we will probably see is a much more diversity growing now in relation to Israel. So from the perspective of the affiliated communities and the establishment of American Jewish community, the stress, I think that what you observed is the issue. But I think that there would be a backlash about it because there are many people who don't necessarily identify with the political entity of Israel, and I don't mean that they are anti-Israel, but that they may have problems with Israeli politics as it is now. But one thing that I always say is when you live in Israel, when you are part of Israeli society, there are many Israelis who also have a lot of issues with political. So what is important is to be able not only to see that there is Jewish religious and Jewish culture, there is Israel and there is Zionism and the importance of both and the interrelations of both, but also to be able to see that there are certain historical developments, there are certain sections of the society. Israeli society is a democratic society with its limitations, but there is an enormous debate there, and to allow the same kind of debate to be held here. Because one of the paradoxes here is that here in the diaspora, the so-called diaspora, there is sometimes less allowance for debate than you have in Israeli society. And that is a critical topic. I also want to bring it back to other things in the film, because I don't want it to be like the primary issue, and to go back to some things that Said also referred to. There were some symbolic points at the film that I really loved, that I wanted to point them out, that I think they did so well to bring the complexity of what is happening in Israel visually, and sometimes not even with much commentary to go by. So the scene with the siren, you know, seeing the siren, seeing how people stop, how people obey, you know, this because they really feel part of the collective, and how they really have to note that this is the beginning of the Memorial Day to commemorate fallen soldiers. And really much later in the film, there is another scene, and I think you probably shot back to the same event, right? And all of a sudden, you realize that there is another facet that was not part of the first scene that you had. And you see that while Israelis, you know, are standing still, you know, for the full time of the siren, the film, you know, then brings up images of Arab neighborhood or town. And you see that while the siren is going on, the traffic continues and Arabs continue to go. And here, without words, you see the diversity of the dual narrative, what people do and what people do, not because it's dictated from above, but the way that they feel, and that's part of the complex reality of Israeli life. The second reference that I wanted to bring up is the reference to the wall. I think it's Yossi Klein who talks about it, you know, the impact of the wall, and you know, the idea that Jews wanted to get out of the ghetto, and here the separation, the separation wall with the Palestinians. Apartheid wall, you know, and Israelis also call it the fence, so you can see how, you know, the different grades of the.
They don't call it a fence. They call it wall fence.
Wall fence. Yeah. Well, you see all these kind of things. So that is also part of the reality in Israel/Palestine, the wall that separates the two entities. But one of the things that, you know, that the wall separates the Israel from Palestine, but what is not clear in the long run, who is in the ghetto? You know, yes, the Palestinians are, you know, under occupation. There are all the mahsumim, you know, the stopwatches that you have to the checkpoints that you have to go through. But Israel itself also put itself literally and symbolically with a fence. And so there comes a point where you hear, and I think this is the strongest message of the film, that you realize that people both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side talk about the present situation, talk about the need for compromise, and I think it's the multiplicity of voices that really makes the point there. And there's a point where Anita Shapira and Hanana Sharawi, two very strong, sophisticated women, secular women, as far as I know, say something that is very similar, actually. Both of them talk about the danger of the fundamentalism, the rise of extreme fundamentalist fundamentalist religions or religious fundamentalists, and they say this is going to hurt both the people on the other side, but the society itself. And I think this talks to the both societies, and it also talks to the way that, you know, these extremes so often threaten to overshadow the very reasonable voices and the recognition that one needs to compromise if we are to talk not only about the past but about the future.
Saeed?
There are too many things to talk about. But when I talked about 48 as the most defining, you know, events, moments, for us Palestinians, it's what happened really is not as you put it, not allowing the refugees to return, or, you know, it sounds like a diplomatic way of putting it. We are talking about ethnic cleansing, and I think there is. You have all the evidence that you need, really, for that. Israeli Jews, headed by Ben Gurion, they wanted to have a Jewish state with overwhelming Jewish majority, with overwhelming majority as Jews. And the way Palestine was divided in 48, really, even with the part allocated to the Israeli Jews, I mean, it has a majority of Palestinians. So it did not work. So I think there was what Plan Dalit, the D plan, and we have the evidence now that it was a case, partially at least, of ethnic cleansing. And we can talk about, around 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed in 48. And Jaffa, with over 100,000 Palestinians, really was, all of them were evicted. Those who remained are less than 3,000. And the same with Haifa. And the massacres that, took place at that time that make people flee, and of course not allowing them to return. So it's, for Palestinians, I mean, for the 1.25 million Palestinians, 2/3 of them became refugees. And 2/3 of the whole people became refugees. So that's something momentous, and it's still, the effects are with us when we are talking about these days about 6 million Palestinian refugees. It's more than 66 million. These are the refugees of 48. But then you have the displaced, the internally displaced in 1967. So the price Palestinians have to pay for the Zionist realization of the Zionist idea and project is too much, really. And that needs to be addressed, really. And this is what the Israeli governments have been evading, really. This is one thing to say. I'm not saying that Palestinians are without their own problems. They created all sorts of problems. I do not want to be apologetic, but I think the price paid Palestinians is difficult to describe, even difficult to express. And of course, you have the case of the Jews with the Holocaust, which is the horrors which are inexpressible. But it's not the Holocaust really that triggered the creation of Israel as a Jewish state. The decision was taken longer before. And it has to do with the nationalism in East and Central Europe, I think. That's the context. The Holocaust was the trigger. It provided the urgency, the added justification. But the decision to create a Jewish state in Palestine was taken, by the end of the 19th century. And the context is nationalism, the hard nationalism, the ethnic nationalism in Poland, in Russia, in Germany, all over Central and East Europe. And this nationalism is so different from the American or British nationalism. The Anglo-Saxon version of nationalism is what we call citizen nationalism. But in East Europe, in Poland, in Russia, and this is where Zionism, the rise of Zionism was there, really, as a response to Polish nationalism, to Russian nationalism, which was characterized by exclusionism. So the Jews felt that they are being discriminated against, that they are being excluded. And this is what happened to the Palestinians as a result, So I think we have to deal with this kind of nationalism. Try as much as we can to soften it. I mean, the softer it is, the more accommodated accommodating to the other. So we have to make a distinction these days between soft nationalism, which is the liberal, nationalism, and between the hard nationalism of Netanyahu and his camp, really. Another point that I want to make about the future, the solution. I wrote several pieces about my vision for resolving the conflict under the title of Divide and Share the Land. We have to find a formula to divide and also to share the whole country. But this is a topic for a different kind of discussion. What I want to say, even if Israel as a Jewish state is so important for the Jews, whether the Jews in Israel or the Jews outside of Israel, I think that can be granted. But the question is really, what Israel are we talking about? What size, what borders, what orientation, it's, when you talk about Israel, it can be on 90% of the area for historic Palestine, it can be on 70%, it can be on 50%. So the question, if you want a nation state, Israel, a state with a Jewish majority, which means much to its Jewish resident, and also which means much to you while in New York or elsewhere, okay, let's talk about the size of the state. You want also, beside Israel, a contiguous, a viable, a real Palestinian state, also to accommodate the Palestinians. But you cannot have it both sides. I want Israel that means much to Israeli Jews and to Jews elsewhere, and also to expand and, to control the whole area and to leave no space for the Palestinians who are under siege, really. Make no mistake about it. No. Okay. Metaphorically, the Jews in Israel are under siege. But literally, it's the Palestinians who are under siege because of the checkpoints and because of the occupation and because of Area C under Israeli control, which is 60% of the West Bank, and because of the international passageway controlled by Israel, and because of all the other things. I mean, how Israeli feel, whether Israelis feel that they're under siege, that's their psychological problem. They should know how to deal with it. But
I really meant that they are
that
creating a ghetto, not that they're under siege.
But that's, we Palestinians, we are the victims. It's too much to ask us to be the healers also.
I think you would say well, again, I'm going to leave Joe to address if he chooses. No, but I think just two little points. I think that in terms of the settler, I'm going way back, sorry. But Jeremy, in terms of the settlers we present, I believe that Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun is actually one of the most humane, broad-minded of settlers, and I hope that comes through in the film. In terms of one of our big regrets is that Achad Ha'am presence is not felt in the film, but that's the Achad Ha'am Judaism vision is the vision that I grew up with. In my family, the religion we practice is not really Judaism, it's love of Hebrew and Hebrew culture, and my father. And anyway, that's as you can see, it makes me emotional just to talk about it. That's our religion, and what I just want to say something else about the film we tried to create is one where we can hear and not necessarily need to respond, Saeed, to your criticism, and whether I think it's ethnic cleansing or not, or what Benny Morris said about it, or what Ilan Pappé said, and whether it's valid or not. The point of the film, and what I think Joe and I have been seeking, and the pain that Joe talked about, is being able to listen to the other narrative, to try to hear the other narrative, and as best as we could, and we might have not completely succeeded, but to hear it and to respect it and not necessarily argue with it. And I think Joe also mentioned Yuli Tamir's statement about love. And this does make me emotional. You know, I do love Israel.
I was talking about love of wisdom. Don't say the philosophy.
But okay, yeah, but you know, I do love Israel, and I think the challenge in any love story, my wife is here, and you know, the challenge of a marriage and the challenge of any relationship, and Jews do have many Jews have a powerful relationship with Israel, is to see it as a journey that is full of huge problems that you need to try to understand and respect other points of view. And that's what the film tries to do, is respect all those other points of view. And the love story is not over. It may succeed, or it may actually, as Hillel Halkin at the end says, it may fail. It may in the end fail. And that's in the hands of Israelis and American Jews and American Christians and the Republican Congress and Netanyahu and, you know, a lot of people. It's in their hands. And frankly, a lot of people are failing in the mission of listening to the other side. In my mind, there's not a lot of listening on the Jewish side and on the Palestinian side. Anyway.
I'll take that about the Yoel Ben Nun thing. You're 100% correct. And mentally speaking, I just don't really associate him with the right any longer. And so I retract that point.
Yeah. I just want to respond to Richard, your question, and I think it flows into response to what Saeed was saying. In terms of religion and nationalism and nationhood, I think historically nationalism grows out of a very volatile and powerful combination of religious affiliation and ethnic affiliation. Most nationalisms do, and Jewish nationalism is no different than that. What I think is interesting about Jewish nationalism is it's a very young nationalism. I mean, obviously nationalism as a concept is a 19th century one, but as what's interesting, if you look at Jewish history, I mean, I grew up in America, and we were taught to see Jewishness as religions because we were American citizens of the Jewish faith. And it took me a long time to understand the Zionist concept, and one as a primarily secular Jew, which was important to me, is seeing myself because I'm culturally Jewish, I'm kind of religious, but I'm not totally religious, so, you know, and yet I feel so damn Jewish. And Jewish nationalism was a very powerful way of understanding that for me, as I think it was for those young men and women of Eastern Europe who are undergoing this in a very powerful way. But I think that, and we try to deal with this in the film, I think what is happening in Israel and continued to happen is a nation that started out very, very secular, that thought that religion was no longer important to Jewish nationalism or Jewish peoplehood, discovered that, of course, that wasn't true. That the religious element of Jewish life is very powerful, and it intertwines with nationalism in a very powerful way. And that's no different. You know, my wife is Italian. You know, I hear the Italians complaining about the Catholic Church in Italy. I mean, America happens to be, and this is a point to Saeed, the idea of a citizenship, non-ethnic nationalism is the exception in the world more often than not. America is a very exceptional country. Most countries in the world are built on ethnic nationalism, not the civic nationalism of America or Britain or France. There is some countries are striving more in that direction, but by and large, it's the minority, I think. I personally, although some people have a problem with it, and you point out there are tensions. If you have ethnic nationalism, the tension between that ethnic preference of some sort in a state and democracy is a difficult one, and it's one that certainly Israel has not worked out. What makes it, of course, very inflammatory in Israel is not only is there a minority, but there's a minority that was originally a minority that was a majority that was conquered, that continues to be an enemy, friend / antagonist, all of which complicates the lives of Jews in Israel, of Palestinians in Israel, all this stuff. Now, I'm very mindful in talking about this. I talk about this as an American Jew living in New York. You're a Palestinian who lived this history, and Saeed has a very powerful story about his own experience and his family's experience of displacement. So it's in some ways, it feels a little hubristic to be able to try to slice and dice this in a much more sterile, although way for me, though something that's very meaningful to me. The only other thing I want to say about ethnic cleansing is in 48, and again, I know our narratives are not going to completely line up, but I think we look for, again, I assume most people have not seen the film here. Maybe some of you have.
I've seen the film.
Oh, most of you have seen the film. Okay.
Because we were going to maybe show a clip.
Anyone who's seen the
Show a clip?
Okay, but we all want to talk.
We are. Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up in 1 second, then we'll show the clip. By the way, if you saw the film, you can get your parking stamp. Anyway, I think the problem with using the word ethnic cleansing, which has been used, is that it's a very loaded word, and sometimes the word itself can obscure what happened, or from your point of view, maybe not. I mean, and I would just say a couple of things. What we point out in the film, there's no question that, and the reasons, and I won't go into all the details, but there's no question that Palestinians were pushed out of villages. I think the issue of Plan Dalet, which is a complicated one, really has to do with, was there an organized top-down effort to push the Palestinians out of Israel? What I would say is it was clear at some point, I think it surprised the Jewish leadership that so many Palestinians did flee. When they did flee, there's no question they were very happy about that, and they had no intention of letting them back in. It's also true, as someone says in the film, that it's a case-by-case basis in some case. You have someone like Yigal Allon, who was determined to get rid of every last Palestinian he could, and someone whose name I forgot on the other side, who was Moshe Carmel. So there's no question that happened, and there's no question there was enormous injustice, destruction of villages, all sorts of things. I think what probably we're trying to point out now, one person's complexity is another person's evasion, and I understand that, but we were just trying to make that as complex an issue as we can. And the only other thing I would say is, there was tremendous amount of expulsion of Palestinians through one means or another. There was also, as Avishai pointed out, there were Jews who were expelled from what became Jordanian Arab territories. Now, the fact is that the Israelis, the Zionists, won. And by virtue of their victory, many more Palestinians were displaced and I think killed, but certainly displaced than Jews. So while accepting what you say and not wanting to prettify it, I don't want to say it's not ethnic cleansing, but it's so complex, and I think we were trying to get out of one linguistic description that becomes a fighting word so that Jews are able to accept what happened and pay respect to the Palestinian narrative without feeling, I don't know what, while also not feeling, I mean, it's clear that what we did was not this, what the Israelis did was not this fiendish plot, et cetera, and I think that's what happens. It becomes, each side claims victimhood and claims, the Jews, the Palestinians wanted to push us into the sea, the Palestinians, the Jews wanted to do this, and the hope is to move beyond those narratives.
Not the Palestinians, the Arabs wanted.
The Arabs, okay.
I think in the time we have left, we would like to open up some questions. So if you could make your questions as clear and concise as possible, that would be great. Just right here.
I was born in Egypt, Saeed. I was born in Egypt 1936. My mother was born in Egypt 1918. And we were cousins, brothers, uncles. they kicked us out too. Some people left Egypt at night with the bed, practically without clothes. Then I understand the pain that the Jews kicked you out, but you have to understand, I'm not from Eastern Europe. I came from Egypt. I spoke Arabic. My father had a business. He hired Arab. And in a very short time, Morocco Jews, Tunisian Jews, all kind of Jews from our country, we never ask you for a dime. And we are not calling ourselves refugees. We are Israelis, French, and now what's happening now in France, the Muslims or the Arabs are kicking the Jews or killing them for no reason. And where are they going to wind up? In Israel. Then you are causing a double problem. Now, I'm not complaining I was kicked. I was very happy. And I went to Israel. I served in the army. I came to America because my parents came from France. And you are constantly complaining. In 200 years from now, inshallah, there will be peace. But you can't. You have to have a new generation of leaders who, like yourself, who can understand the problem and say enough throwing stones and killing the Jews or killing the Christian even, and coming to a point that you say the Jews are not going to leave and you are not going to leave because you love Israel, you love your land, Palestine, and we Jews. And what should I say? My father had a big house, we had maids, my uncle, all the Jews from Egypt.
Okay, we've heard. Okay, let him respond. Yeah.
The Jews are...
Microphone.
The Jews are lovable and huggable, but the problem is with Zionism, really, not... So we make the distinction between being a Jew and being a Zionist. You know, it's my criticism of Jewish nationalism. I mean, I'm critical of nationalism as a whole, including Arab nationalism also, including Palestinian nationalism. I think nationalism is to blame for all the conflicts between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, between Arabs and Jews. But if you go back to what happened to the Jews in the Arab countries, they were only Zionized much later than. You know, they were Zionized during the 30s probably, as a response to also the rise of Arab nationalism at that time. So I think this, we have to be careful. It's not the Arabs who expelled the Jews from Iraq, from Tunisia, from Egypt. But I think it's Arab nationalism. This is responded to what the Jews did to the Palestinians. So I think it's nationalism on both sides that's to blame. But the Jews lived in Baghdad, in Iraq, in Egypt for centuries, really. And they did not suffer the discrimination that we are talking about. They started to suffer from this due to the rise of Arab nationalism. So I think we have to be careful that nationalism in Europe and nationalism in the Arab world, which is a more recent phenomenon, are to blame for so many things. But also Zionism, the nationalism of the Jews is to blame also for what happened to the Palestinians. That share of the guilt should be recognized. So this is what we're asking for, really. Okay, you achieve what you have achieved, but at least the feeling of guilt should not be avoided.
Yes.
Just a quick historical sort of footnote that maybe somebody would like to respond to. Professor Zidani, you shouldn't forget that nationalism predates the late Arab nationalism and the European nationalism that you're referring to. There were currents in the area going back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenian ethnic cleansing, the Assyrian Christian ethnic cleansing, the treatment of the Kurds.
But all of it is associated with nationalism.
Yes, but all of these currents were there and had nothing to do. Were not caused by the rise of Zionism, nor were they, at least directly, caused by nationalism in Central Europe. So my point simply is that, and I agree with you, nationalism is at the root of a lot of problems in the region, but my point simply is that sometimes the narrative makes it sound as if nationalism was a European virus planted in the Middle East that gave rise to all these awful problems. I think that the facts are rather different, and that the virus existed quite on its own as a result of the end of the Ottoman Empire. And what we saw when that happened and nationalism began to rise in the Middle East was the destruction of many communities, ultimately among them Jews as well.
Well, if I can just comment about that, some of the conflicts are not necessarily explained by nationalism, but even the beginning of the tensions between Israel and between Jews and Arabs are also could be defined as religious. And there's new scholarship that really talks about the tensions between Jews and Arabs, or the way that they perceive themselves during the Ottoman period, mostly as religious minorities and not religious groups and not as national groups. So I think that it's very difficult to have very clear boundaries between what are ethnic tensions, religious tensions, national tensions. But what we can say, and in that I tend to agree totally with what Said said, is that the nationalism is a very powerful ideology. And that, in the name of nationalism, there are all kinds of acts that are done that are really morally questionable, but people who belong to the group, and that's also what Yuli Tamir says, the philosopher says in the film, that's the power of myth. Myth may be fabricated in the sense that we decide where we start the narrative, where we end the narrative, what we emphasize, what we kind of ignore, prefer not to deal with. But it really does move people, and that is the power of the situation.
But your nationalisms, you mentioned the ideas of harder and softer nationalisms. I think that there obviously can be more liberal and less liberal forms of nationalism until 1977. I mean, obviously these didn't happen with just the flick of a switch, but you're entitled not to agree with this. But the labor Zionism of the nascent state and in the early years of the state was a much more liberal and minimalist nationalism than the maximalist and more conservative nationalism that has taken root since Begin's election of '77 and the Gush Emunim, which the film explores. And I'm not in the camp that says I'm with Joe on this. I'm not in the camp that says that the original sin is nationalism. I think that the nationalism is a deep and rich part of how human cultures express themselves, and the communities of shared past and shared future express them. We express that by saying that we belong to an Am, and that is a rich part of my Jewish life, which I would like not to efface. I would like the Palestinians not to have to efface that in their lives. And one thing that we may not have time to discuss today, but I would love to hear your own thoughts, as you mentioned, being a critic of Palestinian nationalism as well. I think we have, and you mentioned we need to divide and share the land. I could not possibly agree more. And I think one of the most interesting and important questions is what Israeli Arab citizenship will mean on the Israeli side of that ultimate border, and what people will choose about once that border is drawn, and what nations they would like to be part of.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Is it not fair for us to add to the consideration of all of these brilliant issues that he is discussing the fact that Israel is a string bean of a country surrounded by millions of people and many nations who deny its right to exist?
Does everyone hear the question?
Yes.
Okay, I'll repeat it, yes. Is it not fair to add that Israel, in the end, is a really small string bean of a nation which is surrounded by millions of other people, many large countries which simply deny its very right to exist? Is that something that we should keep in mind?
I think that if you look, obviously Israel has to worry about security and defense, and it is a small country. But when you talk about a lot of countries denying its right to exist, that has, over the last 30 or so years, that has begun to change drastically, right? There's Egypt who recognizes it, Jordan recognizes it, Lebanon and Syria do not. Saudi Arabia is taking a more neutral position. So I think this was an old fear on the Jewish, among Israelis and Jews, and it was true up until Oslo and the beginning of recognition on both sides. That was true. I don't think that's true anymore. That, again, security is a tremendously legitimate concern, but I think one of the key things that I think Peace Now was trying to show in its urging Begin to make peace with Egypt, and I think also the wonderful movie The Gatekeepers, which came out recently, was trying to show that as much as security and a strong military is important to Israel's safety, equally important to its safety is diplomacy and figuring out a modus vivendi with its neighbors. Now, Hamas does not recognize Israel. Fatah and the PA does recognize Israel. So I think it's gotten more complex, and it's not a black and white issue anymore. That's from my point of view. I don't know.
If I may say something about, what is there between Iran and Israel, for instance? I mean, the essence of the conflict really is between Israel and Palestine. And then the Arab countries, Muslims country, in their own way, support the Palestinians or exploit the Palestinians, call it what you want. But Palestinian Israelis, I think they should, and they can find a way to divide and share the land, really. And if they find a way, and when they find a way, the whole conflict between Israel and the Arab world and the Muslim world really will evaporate. Because the essence really is how to do justice to the Palestinians without compromising the security or the viability of the State of Israel. I think that's the challenge. When Abbas says that we recognize Israel, we want a Palestinian state only on 22% of the area of historic Palestine. I mean, this is the most generous offer by the Palestinians, really, and should be taken seriously by the Israelis, and American Jewry should know how to push Israel to accept such a proposal. But the hard nationalism, of Netanyahu and his religious, ultra-nationalist and religious parties really is standing in the way, really. We Palestinians are ready for peace, are ready for Israel on 78% of the area of historic Palestine, of the land of Israel, if you want to call it. If we divide Jerusalem, if you are ready for a Palestinian state beside, to the east of Israel, in peace with Israel, then we can talk about all the other arrangements, security arrangements, and also demographic arrangement. But in any case, as a Palestinian inside Israel, I should be entitled to be an equal citizen, not to be continuously discriminated against, with or without a Palestinian state beside Israel.
Yes, ma'am.
I happen to be in Israel in May of this year. I hadn't been in Israel for many, many years. I have younger members of my family who've made Aliyah. and I was there for a family event, and it was very, very special to me because I hadn't been there since right after the '67 war, a long time ago. And I was there during Yom Yerushalayim, and I was there during the Nakba. So I got to have two tastes of Israel. And I was thinking about life in the United States. I mean, we're not off so easy here either. We are a divided country right now. I don't think we understand that sufficiently. I don't know what happens to us, but we certainly should be more aware of what difference has meant and can mean constructively and negatively. And so one of the things as a practical matter, I get nervous about Gaza, for example, because I had a great niece who was living in Sderot, and the family prevailed on her years ago because we were nervous about the rockets. How do we deal with a place with millions of people? And I mean, is there a constructive response to that population? So even forgetting about the West Bank and all this other stuff, other areas, what do we do with a tiny, yes, Israel's tiny too, but how do we constructively manage a population that's crammed in? Is there the political will to do something so that people don't spend the money for concrete to build tunnels instead of buildings where people can live and study? So I need help with this because it makes me very nervous.
You know, I hope I speak for everyone here in saying that I think, as smart as everyone up here is, I don't think we have an answer. And I think it's an important thing and it's a vexing issue, but I think it's a little beyond the scope of our ability to answer what that is. I think we can talk to other questions unless someone has a solution that they want to offer. So I think we have to kind of evade that. Yeah, I think we do.
Let's see. No, hang on.
I just want to ask if this is a movie that only Upper West Side Jews could make. And I mean that seriously.
You know, because of its perspective.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it helps to live on the Upper West Side. I don't know. A little Upper West Side nationalism. I believe in Upper West Side nationalism, by the way. It's a very strong ethnic nationalism, partially democratic. You know, I think that I don't know what Oren would say, but in brief, what I would say is that I think the American Jewish community in general, I think the journeys that Oren and I took to make this film, I'm guessing those journeys are happening to many other people. And many people are under very different journeys. But I don't think it's just an Upper West Siders, I think, who could make this film.
American Jews? Oh, well, the Israelis are amazing. The Israelis talk about this, argue about this. Daniel's disagreeing, yes. No, they're much more open-minded, and well, they have been. As Yael said recently, the left has come under actual physical attack by right-wing Jews when they've expressed, and my daughter was in Israel this summer during the Gaza attack, and if when she deigned to bring up that Palestinian children were I get emotional about this stuff, sorry, but were being, killed. It was respected by some and very much disrespected by others that was even brought up. But that's a new thing in Israel. Watch any TV segment from the Knesset and the yelling and screaming that goes on. All opinions are valid, and I find, even on the Upper West Side, that it's sometimes hard, and my children went to the Heschel School, even open debate there, and that's a very seemingly open school. It's sometimes hard to express your opinion. It's changed, but I would say, my father's generation, and which did not really only saw Arabs and Palestinians as a charming part of the Israeli environment, have been facing up to the reality that they're not just a charming part of the Israeli environment and their food is so delicious and how charming their dress is. They have had to face the fact that there's a society there, then a nationalism there, and a community there that has to be not just faced, but respected and appreciated in a whole new way. So I think this film could be made by other people than just two aging Upper West Side Jews.
But it helps.
But it helps.
Irene?
So this isn't a question, this is to say if you haven't seen the film, which I saw it and I loved it, there are tickets available in Alexa. Yes, there are, I just checked.
The snowstorm has, yeah.
I just checked, there are tickets available, when we get out of here, you can, if you haven't seen the film.
I just also, I before I forget, this is a pitch for, just for another film that I've been working on with Menachem Daum, and there's some flyers for it, which has to do with Lifta and these very issues. That's going to be shown next Monday downtown at a synagogue, and there are flyers outside for it. Anyway.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. It's not a statement to be made. When you talk about Zionism in contemporary Israel, is there a strain that denies the Palestinians to have a state?
Is the what?
Is there a strain of Zionism now that denies the right of the Palestinians to have a state?
Yes, there are people who actually, whether in words or in deeds, do the best not to promote the negotiation with Palestinians, with the idea that eventually they will get the way and there will be one state. The question is, of course, what will be the face of this one state? There's also something else that needs to be said, that when you do a survey and you ask people, do you want peace? Do you agree with the two-state solution? Many people would say yes. But when it comes to concrete actions or concrete concessions or concrete decisions, the same people who say yes, they want to do that, they refuse to do it for this and for that. So when you explore these things and when you have surveys about these things, you always have to be very careful to see how the question is phrased. What does it mean? And yes, most Israelis would say that they want, peace and they want two-state solution. I think it still is the most prominent solution. The problem is that how to get there and who is going to make the concessions and to lead it in a way that is really going to fulfill the mission.
From what I understand, the polls will consistently say that approximately 75% of people on both sides will say that they favor a two-state solution, and approximately 75% of people on both sides doubt that the other side is serious about that.
I just want to add to that. In the film, Moshe Halbertal speaks about the tragedy after Oslo, which is that while the vast majority are in favor of a two-state solution and with the 22%, and perhaps even with division of Palestine, the tragedy is that as we know from the the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and by a Jew, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad suicide bombings and kidnappings of Jews and bombings in Gaza, that perhaps a small majority holds the rest of the country hostage and makes it almost impossible, and then it's exploited by the political parties of both sides, and that's the tragedy of it's going to take more than a Mandela or a Martin Luther King or to break that impasse.
Can I add something? But talked about the murder of Rabin and the impact of that on the peace process. But I think we have to look at the two sides, at the Palestinians at that point in time, at the Israelis at that point in time. Like Al-Amir, who committed this criminal act, you have to see the combination of nationalism and religion. On the other side, you have Hamas, with this suicide bombing that preceded that. They wanted to derail the peace process. But Hamas is also this combination of nationalism and religion. This is the hard nationalism that I'm talking about on both sides. It's religion and nationalism, which is Hamas on the Palestinian side, and the nationalism and the religious nationalism now on the Israeli side. I think we have to be careful when it comes to that. This is the real danger to both of us. And they squeeze us in between the secularist, the liberal nationalist, whether Palestinian or Israeli. And I think we should know how to neutralize these extremes and find a way to divide the country and share it at the same time.
Okay. I think I have time for maybe just one more here. Yeah.
So, I don't know if, I'm probably not going to make much sense, but I'm going to try anyway. What somebody mentioned original sin, and I was reminded of...
Metaphorically.
Yeah, but I was reminded of getting into a cab not so long ago, and the cab driver addressing, I guess he saw my kippah, addressing me as a cousin. And so he was a Palestinian cab driver, so we started talking, and as this transpired, this conversation, I was free associating about some recent parashiot, some Torah portions on Shabbat that we read. And I was reminded of the story of Abraham and Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael, the father of the Arab nation. And then, so Hagar gets kicked out, comes back, then Sarah dies, and then actually Abraham remarries Hagar as under a different name, Keturah, and yet again her children get slighted because Isaac gets more. So to me, I think that there is a profound psychodynamic that within the two cultures that I don't hear addressed very often. And I wonder if, for those who are very religiously invested in this process, it may not be helpful if you folks who have the power to get heard, probably, you might not want to look into this original dynamic and what it has done historically and continues to do to the two communities, which are really a family split. I mean, fundamentally, Abraham was a mystic who had a psychotic crisis. In the desert, he cut his penis, it was a wonderful thing.
Now I know I'm on the Upper West Side.
but I think that we should talk more about how God was a limited family therapist, and we have to do his work, as Eshel says, and Buber say, we have to pick up the slack. So, but this is more for Mr. Zadani and Rabbi Kamenovsky. I don't hear enough about the root of the conflict, which is really unresolved family dreck. Renewal.
It's a family feud.
It's pretty clear. That the root is stuff that
And if you need a shrink, he's good. He's not mine, but
family feuds can be very nasty, of course. But Abraham is not a Palestinian to begin with.
Hagar was possible.
Neither Hagar. Hagar is Egyptian, and Abraham is Iraqi. So.
It's like when people say that Jesus was white. It's a culture that.
No, definitely Jesus was a Palestinian. So he's from Bethlehem and Nazareth. No doubt about it. But Abraham is, is a strange guy. And we disagree, really, Muslims and Jews, they disagree. But this disagreement did not degenerate into violence. We disagree about, you call it Aqidat Yitzhak, right? But we call it's Ishmael who was, sacrificed. Isn't that funny that we disagree? I mean, whether it's Yitzhak or Ishmael.
But it's the two wives, Sheikh Sharafan, no?
Yeah, two wives. Two wives, two children. But he was asked to sacrifice his son, his only son. Presumably he used to have one son.
Or the favorite one.
Is it one son that we ascribe, we give different names to him? I mean, are we talking about the same son under different descriptions or names? Or are we talking about two sons and we disagree which one was the favorite, which one was to be sacrificed? I mean,
which one inherits? No, because
you have two narratives
but you have to consult God about all of this, not me.
I think on that note, actually I think we have really run out of time. I want to thank all our panelists very much for a great afternoon. And thank you very much for coming as well.